The life of a foreign correspondent may seem glamorous and thrilling from afar. The reality of that life, however, is not necessarily always so. Sean Mallen will be a familiar face to many here in Ontario as a longtime reporter for Global News and former host of Focus Ontario. He reflects on his time and his family's adapting to the foreign correspondent's life in his new book. It's called Falling for London, a Cautionary Tale. And Sean Mallen joins us now for more. Great to have you in that chair.
Good to see you.
Let's set this up. The foreign correspondent gig is really one of the jewels in the journalistic crown, and everybody at some point in their life wants that gig, and you did for a lot of years. Never got it, and then one day Global lets you know what, Sean? You're going to be the guy. We're going to send you to London. You're going to be the European bureau chief for Global News. What was your reaction when you got that news?
Shock, because I'd come close a few times for other postings, but always seemed to be the one who came close with no cigar. And I'd had good interviews for the previous ones, thought I'd gotten them a couple of other times. For the interview for this one, I thought, okay, it's one last chance. And the interview went very well. Both the producers doing the interview were friends of mine who I had great respect for, a very respectful interview. But the impression I got was they wanted somebody younger.
Because you were 55 at the time?
Early 50s, I can't even remember, 54,
okay.
52, 53, somewhere in that range, early 50s. They wanted someone more socially media active. At that time, I was only beginning to creep into the Twitterverse. And in general, maybe somebody who was more willing to go into dangerous spots. I mean, I remember a question from the interview was, at that time, Libya was in the middle of a civil war. And they say, well, what if we sent you to Libya? How would you get into Libya? And here's where the BS factor comes into play. Not that is ever a factor in journalism,
Never.
Or especially TV journalism. And I said, well, I'd go to the border and I'd start asking people, just make some connections and find my way in. I hadn't the slightest idea how the heck I was ever going to get into Libya, if I was ever sent there. But evidently, after years of broadcast journalism and speaking about things with expertise, whether I have expertise or not, and making myself believable, I guess they believed it. So yeah, it was a moment. I was actually in my office at Queen's Park on the 4th floor, 2 floors above the Premier's office. And at that time, you might remember, it was the lead up to the 2011 federal election. Mm-hmm. And in those days, we would take Focus, the provincial show, and turn it into a national show and invite leaders to come on. But there were some complications at that time, to programming issues that might push us off to a time slot that would make it unlikely to happen. So I got a call from the producer of Global National, who also had national responsibilities, in the afternoon. He asked me to call him. So I gave him a call, expecting it was something about Focus, expecting to say, okay, can we take Focus National? Is this going to work? Can we find a new time slot? And his words were to the effect of, well, we're going to take that off their hands because we're sending it to London. So I kind of sat down and I thought, okay, great. And you compare that to what it might have been if it had happened when I was 30, in which case it would have been, yippee, call a taxi, head for the airport.
Well, maybe one of the reasons you were a little bit leery about the whole thing was you have a wife and daughter.
Exactly.
And you told your wife, and what was her reaction?
Well, she had said before, apply for it. I'm not saying we're going to go, but I don't want to stand in your way. So the first call was to her, and she had a similar response to mine, which was, well, great. I'm proud of you that they're finally recognizing that you could do this kind of thing. And I just said, yeah, we have a lot to talk about. I'm going to come home and we'll talk. She said, oh, yeah, okay. And the call ended. So I go back to my desk, start packing up my stuff, and the phone rings again, and it's Isabella, in tears. We can't possibly go to London. How can you possibly do this? We've got so many things going. I can't leave my family. I've got a great job. What do we do with Julia? And
Isabella, your wife, Julia, your daughter.
Julia, our daughter, who was 6 at the time. So thus began about a week and a half of pretty intense negotiations, calculations, getting advice from my predecessor as a Europe bureau chief, calling my cousin who lives in London, asking with what they were offering to pay, whether we could live in London. And she said, well, you might be able to go out once a month on that.
Well, here's the way you put it. You said, here I was on a journalistic adventure of a lifetime, and my family was miserable.
Yeah.
First question I have to ask is, are you still married?
We are still married.
You are still married.
And this is the credit to my wife and daughter.
No kidding. For finally agreeing to this and
important part of the story is how they and I adapted to this incredible opportunity. Because you have to look at it through their eyes, because some people look at it and say, oh, you're going to get to London. Isn't it great for all of you? Well, you have to think about the other people in the equation, because Isabella had a terrific job. She was a producer of the online program for House and Home Media, which was, at that time, was a real forerunner. And it was a lovely, elegant program that she had a lot to do with putting on the air. Had family close by, friends close by. We had our house. We just committed to doing a giant kitchen renovation. And Julia was only 6. You know, she was in a public school here, happy with her friends, happy with the babysitter she stayed with after school. And I was asking them to basically settle that aside and move to a city that they had never seen before.
It's actually worse than that, Sean, because you actually told them to settle that aside, move to a city that they hadn't seen before, where you weren't going to actually be maybe half the time, because as the European bureau chief, you'd be jetting off to various other cities to do your reporting. And
with little notice.
With little notice, and they'd be on their own.
Exactly.
Once the reality of that set in, how did you make the sale?
Well, it was a lot of back and forth. And a friend of both of ours at Queen's Park, Randy Rath, who I shared an office with, I confided in him that this was on the agenda, but I hadn't, no pun intended, possibility that I had this opportunity and I wanted to tell everybody about. And he gave a very telling line, well, you'll always regret it if you say no. And Isabella got some advice from friends and family as well, including her sister, who was, was a reporter as well, Ava Favreau for CTV. And basically, I think she came to the conclusion, well, we can't stand in the way. It's tough for me. So to her credit, she decided to make the sacrifice.
And did you feel guilty every time you got on a plane to go somewhere else?
Yes. Yes.
And was she happy about that?
I'm not sure if happy is right, but she, in fairness, she wanted to remind me that, yes, this is a lot. This is a lot. And when you're going somewhere, I'm going to be left in a city where I know no one, and where our daughter at least will be in school. I should say that we delayed, this was in April when it happened. I got the offer in March, moved there in April in time to cover the royal wedding of William and Catherine. And the decision was that they would stay behind in Toronto and move in the fall so Julia could start school, so she could immediately be into that kind of framework. So not only was I off playing foreign correspondent to London, Isabella was still single mother dealing with kitchen renovation and full-time job back home in Toronto. So yes, it was a debt that I owe them, that I will be repaying for the rest of my life.
But here's the thing. You would think that the culture shock of moving from Canada to London, UK, would not be that significant. After all, the language is the same, the system of government is the same, many of the customs are the same. Was that your finding?
Much is the same, and you can more or less be understood. Accents can be kind of challenging at times. They do have different words for some things. But London is, I think, the world's greatest city, but like many great cities, it's a challenging place to live. 2 huge issues to deal with anyone moving to London. Find a place to live. And if you have children, find a school for your child. So we did better with the latter than the former. Finding an apartment was a soul-sucking experience there. And dealing with the estate agents in London, half of London have to be estate agents. And they continually will tell you, get on the phone with them, as I would call, and I'd say, here's my budget, here's what I have to spend, here's the area I'd like to live, because I'd like to be close to the bureau, North London. And invariably they say, oh, no problem, we will certainly find you the most lovely place. It's well within your budget. Well, here's the reality of moving to London. Unless you've got a true expatriate deal where they cover everything, which don't exist really anymore in journalism, there is no place in London that is both lovely and within your budget. So you have to make compromises, which is what we did.
Here's part of the email that you sent home to family and friends describing your situation. Here's what you get for $3,450 a month in London. Cracked ceilings, drafty windows, cacophonous rattling washer-dryer, filthy common area, lady downstairs who plays the same music every night at 11 p.m. and who thinks English neo-fascists have great ideas, and now the coup de grace, a collapsed ceiling in the living room. You walked into your apartment. We're going to show a scene of it. There it is right there, and that's what you found. What happened exactly?
Well, luckily we were not in the apartment when that happened. We'd been there a few months by this time. It's in an area called Belsize Park, I should say, which is a lovely area of North London. People like Helena Bonham Carter lived there. Gwyneth Paltrow lived there during our time in London. So there are many elegant, very expensive places there, but behind some of the stately facades are dumpier places like ours, which had a bathroom which the design is something on the order of early Alcatraz, I would say, and the mini kitchen had what appeared to be toxic waste that poured down some of the cabinets, removing all of the finishing off them. It had a beautiful reception room, main living room, which is where that picture is from. And yes, it was a March night. We'd been there a few months. That was the apartment that Julia and Isabella and I had moved into in September. And Isabella had said from the beginning, this place is troubled. It's got all of these issues as described in that passage, and we really should look for something else. But at that time, I didn't even know I was staying another year. So let's stick it out another month or two, see if I get renewed, and we'll deal with it then. But then we came home on a March night, opened the door, and our jaws dropped when we saw that.
I can imagine.
Julia jumped into the closet and pulled out an umbrella to put it over her head and saying, my life is ruined. And Isabella was saying, yes, at last we can get out of this dump. Here's our excuse to get out of the lease. And it's interesting, I've told this story to a few people who live in London, and they've said, oh yeah, that happened to me. It appears that there's an unreported epidemic of falling ceilings in London, which of course is populated with stately houses with 150-year-old plaster. So that what ensued after that was about a week and a half of pretty intense negotiations with the guy upstairs who was doing renovations, which we say precipitated the falling, with our landlord, who was mainly absent and uninterested and still expected us to pay rent for that month or that week that we couldn't live in there, and quick negotiations to get us the heck out of that place into another place.
Okay, so in spite of the roof falling in spite of occasionally tense relations with your wife, with whom you were in fairly constant combat because of all the things that were going on, in spite of the fact that your daughter had some issues trying to adapt to school and so on and so forth, in spite of the fact that you were jetting off to cover various things, do you remember the moment when you finally thought to yourself, I love London and I belong here?
Well, for me, I always loved London. I loved London when my first visit back in my early 20s, when I arrived with an impossibly sparse backpack, no idea of what I was dealing with, and stayed in flea bag beds and bed and breakfast joints, and didn't matter. Because you've been to London, I walked the streets until my feet were bleeding and astonished at every sight. So I loved London from the beginning. Which is why, yes, I aspired to a foreign correspondent job, but if it was a choice between Washington or London, for example, which was often the choice, London was always my first choice. So it wasn't an issue for me. For them, it was a gradual process. So yeah, the first day of school was tough for Julia, but almost immediately the staff at the Royal School Hampstead, where she was going to school, showed such incredible kindness towards us, and the other parents there showed such incredible support. There were quite a few expatriate parents there, and Julia started making friends. Isabella started making friends, and there's a term that I talk about in Falling for London. It's called trailing spouses. Trailing spouses are people, often remarkable people in their own right, who set aside their own career ambitions to support their spouse, almost always the husband, who gets this opportunity to go to a place like London for a chance of a lifetime. So we met an opera singer from Australia. We met a teacher from Toronto. We met a chef from Calgary. We met a writer from New Jersey, all of whom remain longtime friends. So it was them gradually building these personal connections, which I never could have done because I was busy with work, that made the whole experience so much richer. So it's to me, and I hope it comes through in the book, it's a story of how they overcame and adapted. Julia adapted, became a really very impressive, self-assertive, charming kid. Isabella adapted and found a way to make new friends, to find things to do, and to make her own experience there richer.
And they eventually did fall for London.
They did indeed.
Now, how about your job? Did the reality of being a foreign correspondent match the glamour that you hoped would be there?
I was incredibly fortunate with the arc of the stories that I had over those 2 years. I mean,
for example?
Well, it started with the royal wedding. I'm not particularly a royalist. As
But
you
it's a
read
great story.
it's an inescapable story
Yeah.
there, but it's fun. It's also fun. If you're interested in history and you're interested in tradition, it's a fun story to tell. And my cameraman was less enthused about it, but he also recognized that it's inevitable. You're in London, you're going to cover the royals. So there was that. But on the other side, there'd be something like the London Riots, which was an extraordinary story in the first summer I was there.
Let me read an excerpt. We've got that right here. Sheldon, here we go. There were days of troubles, with the craziness spreading to other cities. Even nice neighborhoods were hit. Thugs pushing their way into restaurants, demanding that patrons hand over their wallets and purses. This was no longer solely a race issue. Public order was breaking down. How scared were you?
There was one incredible night, I think it was the second night. There'd been riots in an area called Tottenham first, after a police shooting of a black man. And then it sort of metastasized. And then there was one day we were watching from our bureau giant fires on the south side of the city, hearing stories about reporters being roughed up, being chased down the streets. And it was getting worse and worse and worse. It was like London was spinning out of control that night. And then we were bringing, as it works when you're a two-person bureau, you're bringing in the video to build your story based on what you're getting from from your main networks. And then Dan, my cameraman, Dan Hodgson, noted a tweet, hey, there's something happening on Camden High Street, which is just outside our office. I said, okay, well, let's grab the little camera and head out. And we headed out, and sure enough, there was, actually before I went out, I looked out of my window there over an area which is normally a bustling market, the Camden Market. And I looked out there, it was a hot summer night, and I saw guys in riot police walking through the area that used to be, during the day, selling T-shirts and Turkish wraps and that kind of thing. Anyway, we walked out to the high street, and sure enough, there was a police line going up. Down the street, some guys had smashed up some windows, and police were keeping everybody back. And as you do in those kinds of situations, you quickly shoot a stand-up to say, it's now come to our area here, and we started to go back in to file that. And it's, to get into the back door of our bureau there, it's a dead-end street, old brick walls on either side. During the day, it's full of kiosks of people selling stuff. It was empty that night. It was like a scene out of Jack the Ripper. And as we were walking down the street back to the back door, we noted there were two guys following us. And Dan kind of saw out of his eye as well, the corner of his eye as well. So we hit our pass card on the back door there, which is this old iron gate that always opens very slowly. And we were ready, and I said, I think we need to hustle up the stairs there. And he said, yeah. So the door opened, and up we ran. And half an hour later, our colleagues from CTV down the hall went out to try to do the same thing and didn't even get out there because the police were chasing them off, and it was just too dangerous. So it was a crazy night, and later I read up on some of the history, that kind of thing happens in London from time to time. There is this odd undercurrent of violence that will spark up out of nowhere. And it's happened, every few centuries it happens. And then it dies down immediately, and London returns to be London. And 2 or 3 days later, there was much talk about what had happened for many weeks, of course. But within a couple of days, London was back to London. So it's one of the fascinating things about that vast and complex and historic city.
Let's just, in our remaining moments here, talk about the irony of the fact that after you spent some time there and had this great job, you are no longer in journalism.
No.
You got out shortly thereafter. How come?
Because it was kind of a career peak. I did my a little under 2.5 years there, and I had a job waiting for me back here. We would have happily stayed, by the way, but the contract was up, and it's not a place you can live as a freelancer very easily with a family and with a wife and daughter. So we came back, and I had a job waiting for me at Global doing local news, it was fine. It was a good job. I still enjoy doing journalism. I did some interesting things for the public affairs show, 16 by 9, now sadly no longer in existence. Mm-hmm. But I was starting to feel like, okay, I'm now starting to repeat myself. I'm doing stories that I've done 20 years ago. And I was thinking, in the latter part of my career, maybe it's time to try something different. So I'd spent some months talking to people who had made the move over to communications. Many journalists do. And got some advice from them, and gradually started to get more confident that I could do it. And then after a certain point, let it be known that I'd be interested in a buyout if one was available. And so it came to pass.
Do you miss journalism?
No.
You don't, eh?
No. I mean, I'm constantly interested in it. I mean, in the age of Trump, who can not be? And what's going on down at Queen's Park now is an amazing story. I covered Queen's Park for so long as well. I was drawn back into it briefly this past year. Our friends at CPAC hired me to cover the provincial election, to do a half-hour piece on that, it was interesting to be back in the saddle. And I still have great respect, and I'm very supportive of everybody who does what you do and our friends at Queen's Park do, and everywhere, and what's going on in Washington now, especially, about the importance of everything we do. So I watch it with much interest and try to tell stories now from the other side on behalf of clients.
What's the one piece of advice you would like to leave people who find themselves in circumstances like yours, where you get the dream job late in career, have to upend your lives with family? What's the piece of advice to make it all work better?
Think about your family first, because you're over the moon because you've gotten a great job. I had the easy part. I had the great job opportunity, but you have to think about and be respectful of what they're going to be going through as well. Now, to their credit, Julie and Isabella did their own work to make it for them as well. And I have to actually give a big plug to my wife, because the book actually happened because of her, not because of the whole experience, but on the day that I was going to London to take up my job, and the taxi's waiting, and I was about to walk out, she handed me a journal.
Yep.
And said, if you're going to put us through this, you better write a book, which was very wise and generous advice, because she saw before I did that I'd never have a better opportunity, and so it was.
And I got to tell you, you are brutally honest in some of the conversations you create between your wife and you. Oh my gosh, you guys do like the F-bomb, don't you?
Yeah, my sister read it, and she was kind of impressed about how often the F-bomb appeared, because I don't invoke it very often in front of her. But
it's in the pages.
Life is life.
It's a great read. Falling for London, A Cautionary Tale. Sean Mallen, thanks a lot. Great to see you again.
Thank you so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.